So as part of Aboriginal and nowadays Torres Strait Islander customary practice, when visiting the homelands or country of another community, it's important to be welcomed by the traditional custodians of that place, if possible. Where this isn't possible, the visitor still needs to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country which they are visiting. Acknowledgements of country allow the visitors to recognise and pay their respects to the traditional custodians and to also be protected by the ancestors while visiting. As the artworks in Ever Present have travelled to Singapore, we'll be acknowledging the custodians of the country from which the artists came, and National Gallery of Australia have given us a quite lovely form of words with which to do this, so I'll read it now. We respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country where each of the First Nations artists resides or where the art in Ever Present was created. We recognise their continuing connections to country, community and culture, and pay our respect to their elders, leaders and artists past and present. We respectfully acknowledge all First Nations traditional custodians whose art we are currently exhibiting in Singapore. So thank you so much. This is our very first public program for the exhibition Ever Present, First Peoples Art of Australia. My name's Phoebe Scott. I'm a curator at National Gallery Singapore and one of the collaborating curators on the exhibition. And tonight it's my great honour to introduce Tina Baum, lead curator of Ever Present and curator of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art at the National Gallery of Australia. Tina is from the Gulumirrgin, Larrakia, Wardaman, Karajarri peoples of Northern Territory and Western Australia, and she has over 30 years' experience working in museums and galleries throughout Australia. She's been the curator of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art at the National Gallery of Australia since 2005, where she curated the magnificent Defying Empire, third National Indigenous Art Triennial in 2017. She's a recipient of the Australia Council for the Arts Arts Leaders Program and an alumnus of the British Council Accelerate Program to the UK in 2009. She's also a mentor to alumni and a presenter and organiser of the National Gallery of Australia and Wesfarmers Indigenous Arts Leadership and Fellowship programs since 2010. I can also say on a personal note that the curatorial team at National Gallery Singapore for Ever Present has had the privilege of collaborating with Tina on this exhibition for over a year. And we were deeply inspired by her as a curator and as a person, and struck by her immense generosity in sharing her knowledge with us, her deep care for the artists that she works with and for their communities, and her ethics, passion, and commitment. And I have to say, during the last 5 intensive weeks when she was also here with us for the installation, it was not only the curators who experienced the Tina effect. I feel that the entire exhibition team, installation team, conservators, curators alike, were all galvanised and energised by her presence. So I'm so happy tonight to be able to introduce her to speak about the subject that she's so passionate about, the art of the First Peoples of Australia, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I think it will be really exciting and wonderful to learn more from her this evening. Okay, thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Phoebe. Just wonderful words. You know, you often work in silo and, you know, do these projects late at night and early mornings and, you know, you often forget about, you know, the broader project team and that until you're there with them. So thank you for those kind words. All right. Where are we? I need more space. Okay. Oh. And timer. So. This is it. So today, for my presentation, we've looked at the ever-present First Peoples Art of Australia exhibition, or I'm certainly looking at it in a different light. So I follow on from Phoebe's acknowledgements, and of course I wanted to just let any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the audience just to make them aware that there may be names and well, not sounds so much, but names and images of deceased First Nations artists. Being in Singapore, coming from Darwin or Gulumirrgin, it's very similar. And so I've been here for 5 weeks and it's felt like home. So I thought I'd just add some pictures of my home that whenever I get a chance to go home to, Singapore in so many ways just reminds me of it. So I'm very, very comfortable here. As Phoebe's done a fantastic acknowledgement, I also wanted to add to this that I also respectfully acknowledge not just the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or First Nations peoples in the exhibition, but all the diverse communities within Singapore as well. I've learnt so much about, the history, going to all of the cultural institutions, the backgrounds to not only the National Gallery of Singapore and, crazy things that I didn't really realise that occurred here in the City Hall, as well as the Marina Bay Sands. As everybody says, Crazy Rich Asians was up there and all these sorts of incredible spaces within Singapore. But I also really wanted to, acknowledge the diverse communities that are here, which make such a dynamic place to be at the moment. Now, as yesterday was the National Sorry Day in Australia. So it's an important day for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It recognises the initial tabling of the Bringing Them Home report, which is still available online if anyone ever has the heart or energy to read it. It's really quite harrowing, but, it's very reflective of experiences of many First Nations peoples in Australia. There was a subsequent government inquiry into the theft of children, essentially. So yesterday was a really important day, and so having the exhibition open then was really quite poignant, and particularly with the number of the artists and their works in the exhibition that cover the Stolen Generation subject. I really wanted to respectfully acknowledge all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including my family members, who through government regulations were forcibly removed as part of the Stolen Generations from their families, communities, identity, and also were denied an ongoing connections to their country, culture and language. I recognise those who are still on their journeys to reconnect, recover, revive, reclaim and to tell their stories. We often talk about First Nations peoples and their strong connections to culture and country and language. Not everybody has that, and for various reasons and for through various experiences, the Stolen Generation and those that have lost or had their culture taken from them is not often recognised. And I really wanted to do that, particularly after yesterday's anniversary. So looking at this presentation, meeting new people, talking about yourselves and why, and, who are you and what's your position in the world and within your community. I thought a very brief snippet as to who I am and why I do what I do. I've worked in museums and galleries, as Phoebe's mentioned, for over 30 years. I originally wanted to be an air traffic controller, but that didn't work out. But it was when I was a teenager in Darwin, and they had an open day at the Museum and Art Gallery of the Northern Territory, and I saw the taxidermied animals, and I thought, wow, that's so cool. I want to be a taxidermist. However, back in the day, the typically senior men that were the taxidermists at the time were not thrilled at the idea of a woman now, trying to get into their space, although now there are many female taxidermists, which is wonderful. Unfortunately, they kind of convinced me, it's not really my trade. So, getting into museums and galleries, I've learnt so much across the country, and, working in these major institutions, working with communities, and because museums and galleries, of course, have never had, well, maybe not so much now, but certainly in the past, they've not had the best of reputations where it's just been taking and collecting of, our peoples, their remains, their cultural materials and photographs and as such. So, as mentioned, I'm Larrakia. I primarily identify as that because I lived in Darwin, where my mother's homelands are. We are of the Crocodile clan, the Dungalapa. So I was pretty chuffed when I saw this marking in the ground one day at the beach nearby that, the ancestors are there, and they show themselves at the right times. I wanted to give this one, I'm the gorgeous little one on the bottom left, a classic 1970s kind of photo. But this is my family. I'm from a very large family. I'm also proudly Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and have European ancestry as well. And it's that culmination of stories. So when you hear these stories from your families and your ancestors and your parents and what they have gone through, and sometimes sort of matter-of-factly, when my mother had said to me that, oh yeah, she was taken away and sent down south, and that was when I was in my late 40s. It's like I'd never heard this before, and she just shrugged her shoulders and said, well, it happened to everybody. So, it was not a big deal for her. But the way that our elders and, our family have dealt with, their histories, their lives, wherever they've been, has really, grounded me. So their journeys, their experiences, it's an integral part of who I am, and I'm proud of all parts of it. And so, it's that background and grounding that has really driven me to, stay in a sometimes quite hard sector to be in when you're dealing with, big white institutions that have done things a certain way for centuries and have regulated access and, how we as First Nations peoples have are represented to the wider audiences and to the world. It's been an incredible journey to stay in here and to make a difference. So when you get opportunities like this to curate the ever-present exhibition or exhibitions of this scale, there's just so many opportunities to be able to make it as meaningful as you can for the artists and for the communities that you're representing. So, that was just a quick one, so don't worry about that. So today, of course, is again, another important day and week for Australia. So Reconciliation Week, starting today, there are many important anniversaries and celebrations that occur during this time. Certainly a lot of acknowledgement. So, let me see, I'm on the right slide, yes. So, of course, 55 years ago, in 1967, the Australian public decided via a national referendum to change the Australian Constitution to include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the census and to be counted as citizens in Australia for the first time. So the 27th of May 1967 was such a pivotal moment in not only First Nations people's lives, but in Australia. It was the galvanising of the public to come together to vote overwhelmingly 90.77% to say, yes, let's change the Constitution. So it's not only to be counted as citizens in Australia, it's also to give the Commonwealth Government the power to unify laws across the country. If you can imagine, so this is only 55 years ago, so well within living memory for many, many people. The laws and regulations across the different states were vastly different. You know, the governments in New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, etc. If you cross from one to the other state, you could be arrested, you could be jailed. Governments at the time decided who you married, where you lived, whether you kept your children or not, whether you could access land and such. So this was a critical time when people's lives were just incredibly regulated. So today's date, today, 55 years ago, was just such an incredibly important time. And so when, you know, we look back and you're probably thinking, well, why am I getting a history lesson? It's like, well, many of the artists, if you think of the 150 artists, the over 150 artists that were featured in the exhibition, and I counted every one of them, 138 were born before the referendum, so were not counted as citizens of Australia. I'm not in Australia, of Australia. Yet, you know, we celebrate them now. We are absolutely overjoyed and enamoured with their works today, but only 55 years ago they weren't even counted. So it's a really important day in so many ways. And also, like I said, with the government, the Commonwealth government, unifying those laws, they then took control, and then people's lives became so much easier in a lot of ways when it comes to, you know, having agency over their lives as to where they lived and that. So, you know, so when you go back and you talk to family and members what their experiences were, you know, it's a, you know, a really interesting part of history. So 138 of the over 150 artists in this show were not citizens. So I just thought that was a really important moment to note. This year's theme, of course, hang on, let me just get this up, is be brave, make change. So a really important statement, and I think one that I think we're doing that here now too. You know, with the artists that are represented in the ever-present exhibition, the courage that they have to show and represent their stories, their family stories, their community stories, where for so long, you know, our oral histories were rejected, negated, ignored, and not taken seriously. It's a really courageous thing for many artists to, you know, put themselves out there, particularly through their art and or their communities, you know. So there's some really tough stories, there's some really, you know, wonderful stories that are in the exhibition, but, you know, we've got a little ways to go in some areas. So looking at the Be Brave, Make Change statement, I thought, well, you know, how can I look at ever-present in a different way? Hang on. Huge change over centuries. And I thought, you know, we've had some international relations for a very long time. So we're, you know, quite a sophisticated community in Australia. And so, you know, looking at that change and, you know, adaptation that many of the First Nations artists in the show as well as in communities have, I just thought, well, you know, we've got incredible relations that were and are potentially going to be, you know, re-established. You know, we've got some, you know, incredible Indonesian artists here who have been looking at those wonderful exchanges that can occur. And I think there's, you know, I'm really excited at the idea of, you know, quelling the 1907 sort of White Australia policy and, you know, rejections of, you know, Macusson licences to fish into our northern waters. And, you know, it's incredible that, you know, that legacy that's been left behind. So, and of course the, you know, the contemporary engagements that occur through the artist's works as well. Of course, the next major milestone, I don't know if it's a milestone, but it's a major event that occurred is when the British arrived. So it's pretty major. You know, looking at all of these major changes that have occurred within Australia, you know, it's 252/234 years ago when that contact occurred. Artists, of course, are still, communities are still dealing with that legacy of colonisation. And, of course, many of the artists in the exhibition have, you know, looked at how those stories can remain in the public arena, how the loss of the, you know, looking at this one, we talk about it in the exhibition about the language map and how this is a visual representation of all of those major languages within Australia, certainly at first contact. And, you know, of course, there's subdialect within each of these, but, you know, I always talk about this doesn't represent or show those languages and communities that have gone extinct, that where the languages are at risk of being extinct, and how artists like Christian Thompson are looking at, and, you know, Jonathan Jones with his major work as well, how the revival and reconnection of language is occurring today. So, you know, we talk about cyclical moments with culture, with, you know, lessons and that are learnt, you know, communities and artists are, you know, we are looking at that return back to us. You know, again, artists looking at and how to flip the script and say that, you know what, that's one thing that was always said when, as a person working in museums and galleries for such a long time, that, you know, we heard a lot, well, I heard a lot in the early days and sometimes now, where when it comes to our cultural material, our old material that's in these institutions overseas in Australia, that, oh gosh, if the museums and galleries didn't collect it, we wouldn't have it today, for artists to be able to utilise and to reference. However, if colonisation didn't occur, we would still have that practice today. So I call bull on that. So, you know, we've got incredible artists now, of course, like, you know, we've got Julie Goff and Tony Albert here with us at the moment, looking at how to reclaim and reuse the other material. So, you know, looking at how to flip that script again. And so, you know, Tony with his work and looking at this kitsch material or Aboriginalia, as he says, you know, it's everywhere. And of course, it's not until Tony, for me, when I saw his works and when he was starting to work with this material, it was like a light bulb moment. It's like, of course, we had all of those. We had the velvet, busty, naked woman, you know, painting or, you know, picture in the house. We had these kitsch materials because, like Tony said, you know, it was one of those few items at that time, certainly when I was growing up, that had a representation of someone that looked like me. It certainly wasn't in the mainstream media, it wasn't in magazines. So seeing this material, of course, you know, bowls, cups, all those sorts of things, you know, it's interesting how Tony is using that, you know, the introduced material for his works. So reclaiming and reusing it. So, you know, again, major moments, another major moment. As I'd mentioned, the referendum, and as I said, you know, 138 of the artists were not considered citizens or counted. And I just thought I'd just flip through some of the artists. You know, there were so many, I couldn't believe it, that were born before. But, you know, these incredible artists who, oh, sorry, went a bit fast, are absolute masters at what they do and are incredible representatives of their communities and their art practice. And they weren't citizens. Our ancestors, you know, those that were there in the beginning. So all of these artists were born before. But what powerhouses now, despite that, you know? Oops, sorry, there. Of course, there's major milestones. There's other changes and occurrences or events that, there you go, that have happened, that have galvanised and given agency to First Nations artists. So Papunya Chula, the Warlpiri and Lirja artists in Western Desert area and at the Papunya community, which was actually a government government-made community, if you know what I mean. It was about integrating Aboriginal people into society or civilization, as they put it then. And so the artists in that community, certainly the senior men, started painting in 1971, but in 72 formed their art cooperative. So it's the oldest running Aboriginal owned and operated arts cooperative today, which supports over about 120 artists today. So real powerhouses where they have taken agency over who and how they're represented, and just an incredible, certainly with the contemporary artists today, let alone the original founding members, have just had an incredible impact on the arts in Australia, but certainly around the world as well. So another defining moment that occurred is, of course, the Gulumirrgin handback and the Wave Hill walk-off. Really, important times when Aboriginal people were certainly determining and taking back the power to what was happening with their country, with their lives. And of course, Mervyn Bishop, one of the few Aboriginal photographers there at the time, was able to capture these incredibly important moments. When you've got the community there at Wave Hill being supported by Australian unions, they're hitting a nerve somewhere, and so it's the sort of rolling catalyst of all of these events that have really started that sort of snowballing of change in this country. Of course, the next ongoing, unfortunately, I've put 1788 because as far as we're concerned, deaths in custody have been occurring since then. Yes, when the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody was tabled in 91, there were all these recommendations. It hasn't factored in, and that's what, Judy Watson with her works has sort of looked at and said, deaths in custody have been occurring since first contact. It's sadly, unfortunately, an issue that I don't suspect will actually ever go away. The state of the systems in Australia are not as supportive as we would like to, prevent these things from happening. But we can only live in hope. But certainly, if you've got artists like Vernon Arkey who are, if you get a chance to see his film Tall Man, again, incredibly powerful, incredibly emotive, goosebump material, particularly his work, because it's not just a reflection of a death in custody. It shows the raw emotions at the time when people find out how individual Aboriginal people die. And so, really incredibly powerful moments. So unfortunately, I don't think deaths in custody is going to go away. Of course, the next one after that is the Marba decision. It's the 30th anniversary this year. And again, another incredibly important proud moment in Australian history. Well, I think it's a great moment, and where, you know, the Mabo decision overturned the, you know, notion of terra nullius, and how, you know, it really again galvanised and brought so many communities to get together again, and to, you know, really look at, you know, fighting for their rights and their agency a lot better, and more, I should say. Of course, in '97 was the Bringing Them Home report. And like I said, again, it's online if you ever need to read it. And of course, we've got incredible artists. So Julie Goff's here in the audience today. So, you know, if it wasn't for artists where they talk about not only their family stories, the community stories, but, you know, it makes certainly us as First Nation, well, certainly for me it did, and, you know, I always, you know, ask those questions of family and friends and that, you know, what happened to you, what happened, what stories do you know, and so the more that you hear about what happened, I mean, it's sad, as well as, you know, hopefully healing for the individuals that are telling their stories, but go back. You know, the recognition, at least, of this practice in that tabling of that report was really quite important. But, you know, again, we still see far too many children today that are being removed and not necessarily being placed with family or community. So, you know, whether it's taken on a different form or not, that's an argument that's being made. But, you know, artists at least are still telling those stories, which are so important and so vital to share. Now, this is there can be handback. So as a Larrakia person, you know, we talk about, you know, in 1979 when the land claim was for the Kenby area around Darwin. In 2016, we got our land back. Well, not all of it, but we got a really large portion of it back. So when you look at works like 10 Embassy, and is that a thing? Yeah. And you look at this, you know, in 1972, when the 10 Embassy was erected, our elders were there and they were protesting and they had a presence there. Which just makes me incredibly proud that, you know, besides all the protests that they did in Darwin and whatnot, I mean, I was just a wee babe then, so I couldn't participate, but, you know, the incredible pride that I feel when I know that, you know, my elders were there at those, you know, key locations, key moments in time. So, you know, whenever I saw Richard with his 10 Embassy, and I've got a great photo of me and Richard, the year that that we got our land back, in front of that, you know, his poster here was just really quite beautiful. So, you know, again, we've got artists, you know, Prince of Wales in the exhibition, who, as a Larrakia man, unfortunately he, you know, wasn't around when it occurred, but for many, and including my mother who has passed on now, you know, it's been a long time coming. So, you know, again, that pivotal moment in time, you know, when they're protesting for, you know, land rights and getting land back as opposed to native title, which gives you recognition, at least at naming level, the Land Rights Act, which is what the 10 Embassy and all of those protests, early protests, were about. It worked, and it worked for us, at least for my community. Now, the last part, as I mentioned, you know, working in museums and galleries for a very long time, you know, we're looking at being brave and making change. As many have heard me before, I can talk under wet cement about this, but working in museums and galleries for a long time, not challenging or questioning how Western systems of documenting us, researching us and representing us on display. In 2019, I had the pleasure, and it was just so much fun, of spending a year in the registration department at the National Gallery of Australia. And it really, until you spend time to actually stop and look and see what's going on, it really made me question so much about museological practices. So, when we're looking at being brave and making change, at the National Gallery of Australia, we've been able to enact some really powerful and important changes in the way that we deal with communities past and present, and giving agency back to artists as to how they are to be represented on the labels and in so many other ways. So, doing that project, it was always quite jarring to see things, but it wasn't until a fantastic, or an ex-colleague also of Julie Goff's at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, Zoe Rimmer, who had at that time in 2017, I think she was with us, she participated in our National Gallery of Australia and Wesfarmers Arts Indigenous Arts Leadership Program and Fellowship Program. And, these are key programs that are about getting more and more of us, First Nations peoples, into these positions where we can make these changes, where we can, care for and represent and engage with communities, I think, at a much more meaningful and deeper level. When she came along, she had a show that was touring at the time, Karajarri, an unbroken string exhibition on Tasmanian Aboriginal, the elders' shell necklaces, like we have with Aunty Lola's necklaces in the exhibition. And when she was speaking about it and she gave us a tour, she talked about, because, grappling with terminologies in museums and galleries, it was really stumping us for so long. So as part of the project, Zoe and the curatorial team and the community, when they were looking at the old ancestral necklaces and the old material, and of course it makes absolute sense for her and the community there that it wasn't enough to actually have them named as unknown artist or maker. They were then changed to be called ancestors. And again, it was one of those kind of light bulb moments where you think, what, of course they were someone's ancestor. They were known by somebody just through slack practices or ignorant and dismissive practices. Names and details weren't necessarily collected, particularly so for women's materials. So, we looked at and, spoke to Zoe about, being able to use and be inspired by what she's done, use that in what we do. And, many institutions in Australia are certainly grappling with that and looking at how we can better represent our communities. If we can't find out who made them, what is the best way of actually representing them? And so we have at the National Gallery of Australia chosen to replace all unknown makers, artists as such, and name them ancestors. So they are someone's ancestor. They were known. We just either have more work to do or, if we never find out, at least, identify them as close as we can to their communities. Likewise with dual place names. So throughout the exhibition, you'll see that we have used the language name first, and then the Western term for places within the exhibition. So, when you're talking about, making changes, like these can often be really big changes in museums and galleries. So to be able to do this in this exhibition, like really fully utilise it within the exhibition, not only was it a nightmare trying to capture and make sure we've got it everywhere, but to be able to do that and represent the artists better has been, really quite empowering. And that use of traditional language. So now when I engage with artists, I don't just do the usual, name, details, blah, blah, blah. I do inquire about the cultural associations that may be with the works that they've created. We've had a number of works in the show where contemporary artists are reassigning those cultural conditions to works. So we had a number of Torres Strait Islander works that men only could handle. And so, National Gallery of Singapore were absolutely incredible in, making that happen. So, looking at how not only as an Aboriginal person, an arts worker or a curator in an organisation, how we can, be brave and make change. I think, now's the time. I often think whenever I'm dealing with any of the collections and communities, if an elder was teaching me, what would they tell me? Because when I did that project in 2019, with all these bark paintings that I had, they were just called bark paintings. And I thought, well, they wouldn't be called that. If an elder was teaching me about them, what would they call it? Whether it was just a language name or whatever the title is. So, looking at how we as curators and workers can be brave and make change as well. So this is a quote that I had from the Defying Empire exhibition, as mentioned. And, at that time, of course, that was commemorating the 50th anniversary of then the 67 referendum, and many of the works in the show were actually acquired to commemorate that incredible moment in time. That, it's now our time. Museums and galleries and organisations have had their time representing us. There's more and more of us in these organisations that we need to have that power and agency to do this. So, we need to tell our stories our way. We need to represent our communities our way. And if some of those stories are hard, we've been hearing a lot of hard histories our whole lives. So I think it's time that we do that. And of course, as mentioned with this exhibition, thinking about it and thinking about how in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, how to get a lot of the information across, which has been an incredible journey, certainly for me, looking at how to get our concepts and ideas across to audiences who may have absolutely no idea, no concept, no understanding, to be able to engage at a meaningful level. It like I said, it takes a lifetime to really understand everything, and I'm still learning, and I'm, a young 50-odd-year-old, and it's a lifetime journey. So, but as those who have either seen the exhibition or who are about to, some of these works, it takes a heartbeat to just fall in love with them and to appreciate the artist's expression. So, here, this is, the legacy and the sort of final message, I suppose, with Rico Rennie's message stick here, that, when we do exhibitions like this, when we take them out of the, safe space of the nation where, these stories are, when we give the opportunities for artists to tell their stories, which I'm sure there are many First Nations peoples around the world that can actually relate to a lot of what's happened. And when when we're reading I'm reading every day in the news about the reservation or the native schools systems in America and Canada, again, it's like, well, there's so many resonances there with communities across the world. So, as the last sort of, message and that for the exhibition, I hope that, people remember that we were the first in Australia, the first in so many ways, and we're not going to be the last. So, Yanbani, always here, ever present is about us being here and always will be. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful lecture, and I think has given us all so much to think about. So I'm sure members of the audience will have questions they'd like to put to Tina, but I thought I would get things rolling by asking a few of my own first. It's been very interesting for me. Obviously I'm originally Australian. I've been living in Singapore for 10 years, and it's been an unusual experience to return to this history and kind of look at this from here. And as we were working on the show together, I was struck by how much of the work in the show was a kind of passionate tool of advocacy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and a passionate kind of a passionate tool of advocacy, and also a way of making the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people visible. So I wanted to ask you more about that. You know, do you think art has had a major role within Australia in increasing the visibility of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and experience, and in making real political change as well?
Definitely, but I also think it's the role and the works that artists have in Australia is also making Australia visible to the world, making them accountable for what they've done, what they're doing, what they have not done. And so, you know, the visibility is the key thing. And, you know, yes, I'll step back a little bit to that cataloguing that I was talking about. You know, if people don't, if they can't be seen as they are, as to who they truly are, you know, you're misrepresenting them, and, you know, you want to do the best for the artists and the communities, their stories and their experiences. So, yes, it makes them visible, and it's, you know, it's just, that's why I love what I do working in these organisations, but it also makes Australia visible too, which is not a bad thing.
Australia visible in complex ways, yeah. Well, you've spoken very passionately about your work in museum registration and with the museum database, and kind of changing the terminology and practice, you know, within the way objects are labelled and treated in the museum. And from, you know, a profoundly indigenising, and we could maybe also say decolonising perspective. But I wanted to ask about art history, because in a way, the way we organise and present the material in art history or in an exhibition, that also has a certain set of paradigms about how the materials are approached. You know, ideas like style, movements, periodisations like modern, contemporary. And while Tina thinks about this, I can share a little anecdote about the background of this exhibition. We were working on this exhibition for a while before Tina came on board, and our original show was much more kind of art historical business as usual. And when Tina joined us, she insisted that we did not present the show that way. And I think that was very challenging and exciting. And I'd really like for her to share more about that, because it changed our perception about a lot of things that we were doing, and a lot of ways that habits we had of kind of thinking about the way that we present and organise cultural material. So I was wondering if you could say more about that. You don't need to dwell on the shock, but...
Yeah, no, that's fine. Look, often, you know, just to kind of contextualise it, when I talk to my elders and that, and, you know, when they, you know, you think, gosh, they're just incredible warriors, they do all these things, and, you know, you think, oh, when am I ever going to be like that and great? And essentially, when I turned 50, I just didn't care anymore. It's like, we are doing things the right way, that is it. And so, of course, after, you know, spending that year in registration and seeing all of these ridiculous documentation, and how, you know, say, for example, and I've mentioned this before, where, you know, we've got some artists that are, you know, known as, they're listed as like Deaf Tommy. We don't say one-arm Mike Parr. So, you know, why do we have these descriptors? So it was just the Western way of doing things. And again, coming back to how elders would actually teach us. So, you know, when it came to this exhibition and I saw, you know, where it was at, I kind of cheekily just said, no. And just sort of spoke to people about it, because I was so passionate about it, that we are much more than, you know, the olden ways of doing it, you know, the ethnographic representations. We are so dynamic. I mean, I'm saying we, I'm not an artist, but, you know, we as a peoples are so dynamic and exciting and resilient and strong, and have a voice, and like a fantastic voice, you know, the visual voice that we have. You know, I mean, I still would love to be able to have, and we do have with Jonathan Jones's work with language, with Christian Thompson's language. So to hear, it's not just enough to be able to see and read. That's still not who we are. You know, we are more than that. You know, we've got, you know, okay, we don't necessarily want performance and stuff, and, you know, but, you know, when you're representing us and when you're thinking of us as a cultural people or a peoples who have, you know, experienced some crazy stuff, you know, you want to do the best that you can for artists and to think outside the box, think outside the Western way of doing things. If we, like you said, if we indigenize this, how would we do it? You know, and, you know, push those boundaries and, like it says, you know, be brave and, you know, make change. And I think, you know, in this day and age, there's no excuse anymore. We know so much. We can do so much, so why not? And so, yeah, sorry, Russell, said no, we need to change this. So, but yeah, and I mean, I'm certainly happy with it. I hope, you know, audiences and National Gallery of Singapore are too, so.
Well, I think if you visit the exhibition, you can see that it's organised around kind of fundamental ideas to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and history and experience. So you kind of won't find the sets of stylistic or time period based paradigms that we're kind of so familiar with in the way art history is presented. But I did want to ask you a little bit more about that, because I think it's something that we grapple with here also at National Gallery Singapore, where our collection has this kind of remit to be, you know, a collection of modern and contemporary art. And these are terms that we always are having to problematize and struggle with when we think about how we present the material. So for you, in your context, are they meaningful terms or are they meaningless terms?
I suppose for us, or for, you know, First Nations peoples, time, you know, doesn't start there and stop here. You know, it's so cyclical and that. So when you talk about, because, you know, we get often asked about, oh, is that traditional or is that contemporary? It's like, well, it's contemporary traditional expression. You know, some people choose to create works that are informed by their cultural knowledge and that. And their teachings, but like I said, not everybody has that. So, you know, that expression is whether they're from a community, remote community, or, you know, today those sorts of terms are hard ones, you know. At least we're getting rid of, you know, we have gotten rid of, you know, ancient and all these other horrible terms. But, you know, again, it's that sort of, you know, like I said in the exhibition, you know, we talk about modern and contemporary, but we're still informed and connected to the beginning of time. So, you know, that ever-present is, you know, it's, yeah, you can't quite or shouldn't, you know, kind of say, oh, no, this is just modern art now. It's like, well, it's art of now that's from then, if you know what I mean. So, yeah, it's, you know, I think, yeah, we can do away with more terms. Yeah, to make it a bit more, maybe it's not clearer or not, but yeah.
Well, definitely the idea of a kind of a modern period as a sort of rupture or break, you know, which is something that comes to us from the European paradigm of art history, seems particularly meaningless in the context of the art we're presenting in Ever-Present. Okay, well, I'd like to give the opportunity to the audience to ask Tina some questions. So please let us know if you have anything you'd like to ask.
Thanks, Tina and Phoebe. That was just a really fantastic, insightful for all of us talk. And Phoebe, you stole half of my questions, but I have one just to follow on from what you've just been talking about with naming. And Tina, you told me quite some time ago now, about 18 months ago, that there was a fundamental shift in the titling of the exhibition that was a very subtle change, but a very important change. So it would be, I think, people would very much enjoy and benefit from hearing you talking about that, because it really sums up a lot of these ideas that you've been talking about today.
Yeah, certainly. Sorry, that was my sorry Russell moment and Helen moment too, where I just kind of just barreled through. The original title of the show was Ever Present Australia's First Art from Australia's First People, or something like that.
But I think the critical thing was that we had a date range, right? We had a date range.
It was a date range of 1890 to 2020, and I said no, because we start from the beginning of time. So that 1820, yes, that's one of the dates of one of the oldest works in the show, but it's informed by even earlier time immemorial knowledge and connection. So the dates meant nothing to me, and I thought they were misleading, because as we then saw developing those themes, you know, it's about the ancestors and creators, so going back to the beginning of time, because, you know, so many of those ancestors created time. They created the start of life. So, you know, it's a really important concept to be able to get through. And if you've got a date range there, that's not really going to help it. So, I'm not sorry, but yeah.
Don't be sorry. I'm kind of sorry. I was responsible for those dates. The reason was because originally when we were proposing this exhibition, we were encouraged to kind of emphasize how meaningfully it could relate to National Gallery Singapore and our collection. And in fact, that date range is the date range, it's very close to the date range of the materials that are presented in our Southeast Asia Permanent Gallery. It's almost exactly the same date range. So I was kind of trying to make this point that we were looking at two histories that were, or like a set of material objects that were emerging historically, contemporaneously with one another, but unwittingly, I think, you know, it would have been a terrible mistake. So luckily we learned from Tina about a better way to think about this. And I think that was just one of many galvanizing moments that we had with Tina during the course of developing the exhibition. Yes, over here.
Thank you very much for the talk. You mentioned something about some artworks being only be able to be handled by men. And which would those be in the exhibition, rather which works? And then are there works that can only be handled by women? And which would those be? And last question is, could you please explain a little bit about how one should read the last artwork you showed, the one with all the diamond shape and the flask, please? I'm a docent, so I need all this information.
Okay. Yeah, no, look, and this actually came from the artists themselves. So Alec Dupodi from Bardu Island in the Torres Strait Islands has been increasingly re-establishing cultural practice in his everyday, the use of language, the practices that they would have had in the beginning. So when he was actually part of the undisclosed second National Indigenous Art Triennial, he had a series of works there, and that's when it kind of started. And you just think, well, oh, okay, this is really interesting. So, you know, we started to incorporate that and document that in the database, and we've really reinforced it. And of course, you know, had to negotiate with Alec that, you know, there are a lot of female conservators, particularly objects conservators, and, you know, if for whatever reason we couldn't have a man, you know, what would the next kind of level would be? So if it was absolutely necessary, then women with gloves, at least there was no skin touching. So Alec is incorporating that so much more. And it's interesting because I was talking to other artists, say from Papua New Guinea and other areas, and mentioning these sorts of things that, you know what, if you wanted to, you could assign these cultural associations with your works, even though they're contemporary works. Alec's works is fiberglass. That doesn't matter. The material is not as important as the cultural associations to that work. And so we've been following, you know, his request to the letter. And it's really important to be able to respect what he wants. And so we do try to do that wherever possible. Currently in the show, no, there are no women's materials that are, you know, restricted that same way. But we don't have any women's ceremonial material in the exhibition either. So no, at this point we don't, nor in the collections do we. So at the moment there's a number of artists from Bardu Island that are assigning that to their work. So so long as we capture that and make sure that that's adhered to, then we'll keep doing that. And this other, like I said, this other Papua New Guinean artist has actually started assigning that to his material as well, which is, I think it's fantastic. So, you know, if this is how it would be treated in the community, then that's how we should be treating it in this institution. And that even goes back to like a long time ago when I was at the National Museum of Australia when it opened. There was a series of works from the 1960s from Weipa that the community wanted to reconnect with and enliven again by repainting it with fats and ochres. Major conversations with conservation, but this is how cultural material is used, how it's engaged with, and if that's what we need to do as a sector to deal with the cultural practices of artists, then that's what we need to do. We just need to learn to adapt and cope with that. So doing that was really quite, and you know, every time we install it, it's really quite special to do that, because I know just from experience, you know, when you're dealing with certain materials, I know as a woman that it's like, oh, I don't know, I don't feel very comfortable with that. I just want to check and make sure. So, you know, there's just a lot more questions, cultural questions that are asked. I certainly ask anyway. And the last image with Rico Rennie, you know, Rico he's grown up in Melbourne as a young man. He was a graffiti artist, so the spray can, as he saw, was his, message stick for today. And so he's used that as part of his artwork, and you know, and the metallic foil that's used on it is reflective of the neon lights in the city. So, you know, as a man living in, or as I say, off-country man who's not living on his country, he, you know, there's many sides to First Nations peoples. We're not just all cultural people. Some of us love Star Wars. You know, we have other loves and passions. And so, you know, likewise with Rico as a graffiti artist, you know, that's an element that he brings into his work a bit. So, so that's what that's about. No, just kind of city lights. Yeah, city life. So, yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask a follow-up question to that, not about the message stick work, about what you were mentioning earlier about the community's engagement with National Gallery of Australia's collection. Because I think one of the other challenges that we always face in the museum setting is the restricted access to artworks, which to a certain extent, you know, there's kind of necessary parameters for that to do with artwork security, artwork conservation. How do you mediate that with a kind of community's need to engage with their own cultural material and their own work? I
laugh at that because and with my colleague Kelly Cole, it's happened so many times where, you know, we've had community groups come in. We had a group of elderly, senior bark painters from Utakala come through, and they went up to their family's bark paintings. Oh, this is great! And we're like, I said to her, "You're going to tell them? I'm not telling them. That is, you know, we will report. You know, let conservation know, and that's it. But that's their cultural material. I'm not about to stop them from doing that, other than, you know, having a conversation and saying, you know, look, we want to, you know, preserve the work as best we can for their future generations and that's about it. But, you know, we just have to shift the way that we kind of deal with things. But, you know, we do try and say, look, you know, for, you know, if they want closer engagement, we can kind of organise things like that as well, you know, with study rooms and things like that. But, when those things have happened, it's like, I ain't saying nothing. I am a junior woman. I am not about to pull them up for that. So, yeah.
But do you think there's kind of processes that can be developed to help with this kind of tension between the museum's responsibilities and the community's kind of needs and desires?
Yeah, and I think that comes with just the ongoing relationship and engagement with communities, where they get an understanding as to where the institution is coming from, where it's a reciprocal kind of engagement, where, you know, you learn from them. And you know what, sometimes it might be a matter of letting things go and saying, okay, that's a stage of its life that we need to then manage and work with. So, you know, whether it's adding the fats and ochres onto it, whatever it might be, it's, you know, you just work with the communities and just see where things go, because, you know, things like we've got a number of restricted papunya boards that weren't restricted before we did community engagement. They are now. They're dealt with appropriately. And when we go back to the community, they may become unrestricted, you know, depending on the younger generation's, you know, assessment of those particular works. So it's never a simple, straightforward way of dealing with First Nations collections and artworks, you know. For some artists, it is. It's like, you know, and even with, you know, with Tony's works, if, you know, we had with the ash on me, I think one of the, you know, the ashtrays broke. And so, you know, a matter of, you know, working out, oh, okay, how do we replace it? Because that kitsch material is everywhere. So, you know, we can do that. So just, again, engage with the artist and work through those things. But I think we can do it. We just need to have a mind shift in the sector about it.
Hi, Tina. Thank you for the talk. This is such an insightful talk. My name is Lily and I'm from Makassar. My question is about the, you know, if you could share with us more about the female artist. And because I remember yesterday in the opening, there's a statement saying that it's very grateful to see the gender representative is, you know, reflects the equality. But in terms of theme, style, message, and maybe you have some insights about to look at these female artists. Because when I visited Yirkala in 2018, I was so impressed with how actually these female artists, especially the senior ones, really committed to not only the art, but they really religiously believe in this art practice. Stories about that. And if you don't mind, I have another question about the connections, because you start your talk by looking at the early encounters between Makassar Tripangers with the First Peoples in the northern part of Australia. And my research is focusing on this topic. So I would like to ask if you have you know, like insights or comments on that, on one particular question about how actually, or what the major driving force for the artists today to, you know, to choose these encounters as one of the themes that always occur on their work. Because I was really struck when I attended the Triennial in National Gallery of Victoria. There's a recent works, beautiful, striking blue, but I think among the 13 or 15 works, there's like 3 or 4 talk about the encounters as well. So yeah, if you could share your thoughts and insights about it, that would be great. Thank you.
About women, yeah. Being a woman myself, I was a bit biased and just, you know, wanted more women's material in. You know, we've seen the legacy. We've got the Know My Name major exhibition on at the National Gallery at the moment, where, you know, it's about Australian women artists and their representation. I gravitate towards the women's materials and also understand and recognise that history of women's materials and arts being ignored. We've got such incredible female artists in Australia. I can't help it. They're just incredible works that tell such incredibly powerful stories. Yes, that is a consideration to try and balance it. Not necessarily that it's equal as such, or but to really make more space for women artists. And the more we do, the better. I've got 3 daughters and 1 son, so I still do consider the sort of male representation as well, because I think it's important for my son at least to be able to see elements that he can relate to. But for my daughters, and I mean, yes, I've got 7 brothers and 3 sisters, but it's like it's our time now. So so I just naturally gravitated to many of the female artists' works in the collections. And yeah, and then the exchanges, yeah. It's interesting, looking at that relationship with the north of Australia and the Macassar fishermen and that. And even last night, I was reading another document about my family and community, where again it was just a single sentence in this document done by one of my relatives that Larrakia people were used as deckhands on a Macassar prow, and I did not know that. And so those sorts of stories, which I just thought, it's just the Tiwi, it's they skipped Darwin, but no, that is part of that record, but I didn't know that. So the ongoing interest, I mean, it's not just the physical relationship. We've had words, languages, and as they say in Yirrkala, with the use of flags, the dugout canoes. I was approached yesterday by a museum who was engaging with one of my family members to make a dugout canoe, and I'm like, I don't know if we did dugout canoes and that, but that's when I got reading and researching, when I should have been doing the presentation. But I was researching and reading that, and yeah, that's the dugout canoes from what I read, if that's correct, was an influence from, the Macassar fishermen. So, so it's all those sorts of elements where you just think, and I mean, I'm still learning. And so artists today who have had that actual, engagement and awareness and stories, but I think because those communities have got those actual sites, those contact sites still in their country, it's in the forefront of their mind. I'd imagine it's in the forefront of their mind more, and just those stories and interest is there. So I'm not sure why they're still doing them now. I love it. I think it's brilliant, and I think we should re-establish that, relationship a bit stronger and a bit more. But yeah, why it's happening still, I'm not too sure. But we've got language that I didn't realise growing up were, from Indonesia as well. It's just words we used and we were taught. Words, foods, all sorts of things that are part of my everyday, that are part of my children's everyday, that I didn't realise were influences. So likewise with communities in the north of Australia, where those sites, and you've got the scientific evidence of confirming their sort of contacts and stuff that again reinforce the oral histories and that. I think it's an important relationship that I think people are really interested in re-establishing, and those connections that have occurred over those centuries, whether it's through marriage, through whatever it might be, I think they're still strong. I mean, it was only 1907, so it wasn't that long ago, but when that kind of stopped. But, we know people come to visit. They come to visit, fishermen come to visit the ancestral graves. I remember reading an ABC story where community are going around and checking, areas, just the general sort of patrols and stuff, and they've seen, footsteps go to Macassar ancestral graves and then go back. So they're coming to visit, which is great. And so that's kind of being noted. So, officially, formally, that relationship might not be there as much as it was before, but it's still happening. So I'd imagine there's, an ongoing desire to kind of, re-establish that. So, yeah.
I think we had another question from the floor.
Yeah. Hi, thanks, Phoebe. Hi, good evening. My name is Li Ling. I'm also a docent with the National Gallery, Singapore. And I'm so glad that, thank you, Tina, for the talk. And I'm so glad the talk is at the start of the exhibition, so that we get more information so that when we guide our tours, we'll be more effective in sharing. What I'd like to ask is relating to Treasure Island by Daniel Boyd. And over there is, I understand that, there are more than 300 language groups that make up the First Nations of Australia. So I'd like to know how many of these languages are still spoken. And the second question is then, are there any steps or any efforts to ensure that these languages continue to be passed on from generation to generation?
There's certainly active programs, and I think it's like Australian Indigenous, there's language organisations that are established to assist in the maintenance or, re-establishment of these languages. Like I said, with the Larrakia language, they've done courses for community members, like making sure that all the different families are represented, and we have our language lessons whenever we can, and incorporate it in what we do. So there is a big push out there, but again, it comes down to resources, money, engagement with certainly the younger generations, and that the older generation are certainly passing with a lot of knowledge. But when you see things like, I think there was like Palawakani as well, in Tasmania, when you talk to these communities that are actually going through that process, you talk to them to say, oh, how's it going? What have you done to do this? And how do we, those of us that are actually trying to reclaim our language, what do we do? How do we do that? So there's programs out there, there's organisations, there's funding in that, but, certainly with me in my day-to-day and with my siblings, they're just working, doing things, and, unless you are kind of, dedicated and doing these kind of language programs, it's just a matter of just what you can actually, do and pass on to your kids. But, there's a big push at least.
But I mean, it's also interesting in this show. We can see there's some art that kind of asks us to reflect on what it means to have a living language, like the Christian Thompson work at the end of the exhibition, where he's asserting the idea of Badjara's continuity as a language, even if it's kind of technically classified as no longer a living language, because in some sense the knowledge of the language or the vocabulary is incomplete, and yet the artist can redeploy it so that it still lives, it's still heard. So I think that's also, I mean, perhaps not quite what you were asking about, but also a sort of creative conception of how those things might be addressed. Well, I'm going to ask the last question. Sorry, y'all, but it's been such a pleasure to work with you, and it's so interesting to hear about your curatorial practice. But I really wanted to know, is there anything in the Singapore show that we've done together here that is really special and unique that you've never done before?
There's a few. I mean, it's an incredible building for starters. I mean, besides the flooring, levels and things like that.
We have a wonky floor,
which is
right?
really challenging. But, it was great working with, the install crews and that. For me, it was... what I take away from this is a mind shift for me, because, when you're in Australia, you're just doing you with Australian audiences. Yes, you kind of cater for international audiences that might come through the gallery or visit the exhibitions, but, you're kind of primarily looking at either towards First Nations communities or Australian audiences. So coming here and like I've said to you, working through the text and how to get this across to audiences that have a different level of engagement or understanding really made me kind of stop and think even how we do things at the gallery and how we can do that differently even. So, working with you and Z on that text, and that was really, for me, the really important part. And, like you've done with the positioning of, 5 of the First Nations artists in the Southeast Asia Gallery, and, because we're so, well, certainly me, I'm so removed from, you know, this kind of situation, now being put in it, it really makes you think, well, okay, where is our positioning in the world? Because, you know, we were global people, and, you know, that sort of engagement was happening. So how can we continue that, you know, now, with artists and giving opportunities for them to, you know, get out there. But, you know, I think dealing with audiences, engaging with audiences in a different way has been, again, made me think, you know, let alone with that kind of cataloguing and things that I'm so passionate about. Again, how do we engage with community and other audiences has really made me stop and think again too. So, yeah.
All right, well, I think that might be a good place to leave it for tonight. One last question, okay.
It's Sarah. I actually wanted to ask you a question.
Oh my God.
So you still ask the last question of Tina. I think that Tina's always had the courage and the confidence to reshape agendas. And I think it's really interesting, and in a way you've just mentioned it, that you took a very brave opportunity to do that in Singapore to an audience actually which is going to be relatively new for the work. I am very, I think, relatively well informed about Aboriginal art, and when I went into the show last night, I was a little bit wrong-footed. Like my expectations had really been turned around, and I found my gaze wandering in a way that normally if I had visited a show it wouldn't have occurred. And I kept flitting from really sublime works back to what was clearly an agenda that had reshaped the material. And I was going to ask Phoebe, is that going to be a challenge for you, rather than taking the sort of chronology or linear approach to an audience in Singapore with a very radical agenda around the show, does that present an extra challenge for your audiences? Like, had you actually...
Yeah, I mean, when we were developing the show, and I want to say also that several other people in this room developed the show. So Gozi Ying, my colleague here, our former and beloved colleague Russell Storer, and of course Helen Carroll from Wesfarmers Arts. But we did have a lot of conversations around this question because we were aware that the Singapore audience might not be at all familiar with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art and would be encountering this material and its cultural context and the history and the kind of context of recent Australian history as well, which is such a strong part of the exhibition, would be encountering a lot of this material, if not for the first time, then, you know, wouldn't be that familiar with it. At the same time, I think that we all felt that Tina's point of view that she put very strongly to us about making the show kind of centred around these sort of foundational kind of thematic areas was really, really important, and we had to respect that. And we also respected the challenge of kind of not working with a sort of chronological art historical model. You know, we really wanted to get behind that. So what we did was to try and kind of within each of the themes to kind of flesh out the clusters a little bit more so that you didn't encounter kind of single works from a specific region or period in isolation, so that there was a kind of broader picture of the setting even within each theme. And I think, I guess time will tell whether the audience responds to that. But I feel, you know, because of that, there's kind of context for each moment that you encounter the work. As Tina was mentioning, we also worked very carefully on the texts and to try and be really careful about making sure that there wasn't too much assumed knowledge about Australian history or about certain cultural concepts that kind of made it through to the text without further explanation. So I think on those levels we've tried to make the exhibition as inclusive and as accessible as possible for the audience here. But I think on another level there's just some very fundamental ways that the appeal of the show is just evident. I mean, of course, there's the visual power of the works themselves. I think it has been evident to everybody who walked through the show. But the messages about social justice, I feel, are very accessible as well. You know, they speak powerfully to things that we're all concerned about, you know, in different contexts and different ways. So I think there are ways in which the show can be very resonant for the audience, even if they don't have an existing body of knowledge about the work that's being presented. So that would be my answer to that. All right. I think that's probably time to wrap it up, but we really appreciate your attention, and please let's thank Tina for her wonderful lecture.